Good evening, welcome. Tonight, Freedom Stop War is proud to host Sami Ramadani. Sami has been an avid advocate for the peace movement and for many years has been raising awareness of the crimes which have been committed against the people of the Middle East, notably in Iraq, Libya and Syria, by the hand of Western imperial aggression. Sami has spoken on many platforms, including the Stop War Coalition and various media outlets. This evening, Sami will be discussing the US's self-serving foreign policy and how the strategy used to implement this has fomented a rise in terrorism. So please welcome Sami to present to you US intervention in the Middle East and the rise in terrorism.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's nice to be back in Rome. I came here a few years ago with Jeremy Corbyn and I think it was Dan who was the third speaker, and it was a great occasion, and I'm glad to be here with you again. So thanks again for inviting me. Tonight I want to focus on two phases or two aspects of US foreign policy in the Middle East. One, what we call the general political framework of what they have done, what their strategy is, and so on. And on the other, I will refer to the human side, the human cost. I know everything is political, but we need to also engage with certain issues on the emotional level, the humanitarian level, and so on. And there's a cost to US foreign policy in the Middle East. And the cost has been borne by the peoples of the Middle East. There are terrorist incidents, say, in France, Paris, elsewhere, in London in the past. But all of this, despite its horror and effect on us and so on, and its dangers to European societies, pale into insignificance compared to the suffering that has been endured by the peoples of the Middle East. Whether you're talking about the greater, so-called greater Middle East, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, you name it. US foreign policy is often portrayed as a series of mistakes. And this I would like to challenge strongly. I don't think it's a question of mistakes. I think it's part and parcel of United States approach to the world stemming from a social economic system that is prevalent in American society. Namely, the way American capitalism works, how the great monopolies of American capitalism control US society and project themselves onto the world stage as massive multinational, so-called transnational companies, and the United States as a state, as a government, primarily represents these giant monopolies. Whether we're talking about the arms trade, the biggest supplier of arms in the world is the United States. Whether we're talking about control of the main raw materials, oil, metals, and so on, again, we're talking about US companies and so on. And this is plain to see at one level, but at another, when we're listening to the news headlines, all this is lost. It is somehow forgotten in a background. Occasionally you might get a documentary showing the links between US foreign policy and these strategic interests, economic, political, geopolitical interests across the world. We are plunged into little snippets of headlines and sound bites, which eventually, actually, if it's our only source of information, it becomes totally misleading. In fact, it gives us a false picture, even though they show snippets of reality, of facts, but these facts are not put in their broader context. And the broader context is, if we're talking about US foreign policy, the way this foreign policy has been practiced over many, many decades. It didn't start with the invasion of Afghanistan. It dates back many decades. And if we are realistic about US dominance in the Middle East, we're talking about post-World War II scene. Even though the United States started having strong influence in the Middle East, especially once they latched on to Saudi oil in the 1930s and they established diplomatic relations, so much so that Roosevelt said that the defense of Saudi state is part of the defense of the United States. That was Roosevelt talking, because they realized how strategic Saudi Arabia has become through the discovery of massive reserves of oil. And oil became the engine of the industrial world. Without oil, you're talking about not only an energy source, but a very important raw material in the petrochemical industry and various industries. And the United States pursued this interest, and post-World War II, the United States went into a massive conflict with the Soviet Union. And we had what they call the Cold War years. And in those Cold War years, the United States used its allies in the region, what I call client states, like Saudi Arabia, later on Israel. And these states, and if we focus for a bit on the Saudi regime, because that links us also later on to the way Saudi Arabia became the center of supporting terrorist organizations in the region. So Saudi Arabia became very important in the so-called fight against communism, post-World War II. President Eisenhower, in his memoirs, talks about Saudi Arabia encouraging the Saudi king to lead and establish and lead a world Islamic organization. So even the idea of having one Islamic organization stemmed from the United States rather than from the region itself. And Saudi Arabia did pick on that later on and tried to play a leading role in the Islamic world. Saudi Arabia, by the nature of its regime, always behaved in a secretive way. So it financed political organizations, it financed journalists, it influenced governmental policies from Pakistan to the Middle East, to Morocco and so on. But they did it in a very subtle ways, never in public. This has changed in recent years. And their role of backing, there's an echo now, or are you okay? Of backing organizations and states that follow their approach has always been encouraged and blessed by the United States. And when they go too far or too short, they get told off. Like they are being told off today in terms of the full support they give ISIS, for example, or gave ISIS over recent years. Because US strategy, US politics do not necessarily match the policies of their client states, of their allies in the region, whether it's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or Israel, for that matter. The role of Saudi Arabia became even more critical later on, as the importance of oil became even more so, as nationalist revolutions and political movements grew for independence in the Middle East, independence from imperialist control. The role of Saudi Arabia became even more important over the years. The role of Israel became even more important over the years. Without these states, the United States could not possibly have such massive influence in the region. Short of sending millions of soldiers to occupy the Middle East, they cannot really have such influence without the existence of these dictatorships or client states in general. Their interests don't always meet, but primarily when the chips are done, the United States has managed to force these states to follow suit. Now, I would like to fast forward a little bit in terms of what the United States did after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that the United States became the only massive superpower in the world. The Warsaw Pact collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the United States, people and media and so on started talking about the peace dividend, that we no longer need such massive spending on the military and so on, because there is no longer a threat of World War and the Soviet Union has collapsed. Well, none of this happened. Immediately what the United States did was to expand NATO, build more military bases, push into all the former Soviet republics, which separated obviously and became independent states, many of them. And they started encircling Russia with these new military bases. And by the mid-90s and 1998, there grew a quite pronounced and articulated line, which later on became known as the neocons approach to foreign policy. These neocons established something called the Project for the New American Century. And they published their material as to how they see the future post the collapse of the Soviet Union. And their conclusion was that there is a historical opportunity for the United States to not only to expand its influence, but completely dominate the world scene. They came up with documents which were quite startling at the time, but you could see why and how they were looking at things before they came to power. They talked about not only establishing complete, absolute military dominance, but they wanted to stop any country in the world which can bypass the United States technologically. So they regarded the technological leadership as also strategic to US prosperity and influence and the way they projected onto the world. Coupled with that, they were conscious about the necessity of the United States intervening directly, waging wars, becoming much more aggressive abroad. This group of people, once George Bush came to power and 9/11 happened, became very dominant in US policy. So you're talking about who are these people? Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and others in the key figures in the Bush administration. Their policies were quite unpopular. In fact, George Bush himself was not part of that group. But come 9/11, they saw a historic opportunity to apply, to put into practice that line they developed in the mid-1990s. And they immediately started the war in Afghanistan after 9/11 within a couple of weeks. And significantly, Afghanistan wasn't the only target. They had planned, and I will show you my first video. Let's listen to General Wesley Clark, who was NATO's commander in Europe, about US strategy immediately following 9/11.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. He said, I guess they don't know what else to do. So I said, well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda? He said, no. He says, there's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq. He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs from the Secretary of Defense office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
To go through the countries again?
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran.
So really, the die was cast that all this pack of lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and so on.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary.
The line was clear. They had a strategy of trying to select certain countries in the world which they can conquer, either through invasion, through sabotage. They want to control these countries, militarily, if need be. And these 7 countries were chosen. Now, it is significant that you have a chain of them and they want ultimately to hit Iran. Iran in this context is extremely important. Iran is the only very powerful state. If you look at the world map, from the borders of Russia to the American coast, it is the one powerful third world state, which is almost completely independent of the United States. And it's bang in the middle of one of the most strategic areas in the world. They lost control of Iran in 1979. Iranian Revolution, January 1979. The overthrow of the Shah, the dictator of Iran. And ever since, they have been trying to get Iran back to the fold, to their fold, and they have failed. So Iran is a major target, was and still is, ever since 1979. They tried various interventions, stirring up domestic problems, arming certain groups along the Iraq-Iran border, especially in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. All this has failed. Then they concocted the nuclear conflict with Iran, alleging that Iran was developing nuclear weapons without producing any evidence. And the reference to Iran there is significant in today's terms. Conflict in Syria, and also in terms of the Iraq war itself of 2003. The United States' next target, as we saw, was Iraq. So they invaded Iraq in 2003, and perhaps at this stage, just talking theory and trying to imagine what the war was like, this is what happened in the shock and awe attack on Baghdad, city of my childhood. long video, but this is a city of today of about 7 million. It used to be about 6 million people. The majority of the population were children and teenagers. You can imagine the impact, and they called it the shock and awe war. They wanted to paralyze the people, not only in Iraq, but across the world, that this is what the United States is capable of doing. So Baghdad became a symbol for the projection of US power. If Afghanistan wasn't enough, then they can attack Baghdad, which was not only a major city, but also symbolic in terms of its history, links to civilization, and so on and so forth. So Baghdad was chosen with their cameras ready, CNN and so on, to project this massive new US power to the world. But there was a human cost. People often talk about Iraq in the past tense, the Iraq War. This is not correct. The Iraq War still goes on. Not only in terms of the immediate effect on the people of the war itself, things like depleted uranium. It will take thousands of years for the depleted uranium to die off in terms of its effect on the environment, water, the land, and so on. The rise in cancer incidents, birth of deformed children, the entire social, if you like, public services were destroyed. There's a collapse in the health service, transport, education, employment, industry, agriculture, condition of women, children. The catastrophe has been massive, but somehow our media carries on talking about a historic incident called Iraq War that took Chilcot 7 years or to reach a conclusion that we all know about, that it was an illegal war based on lies and false propaganda. Now this war also meant that the United States was getting bogged down, that they conquered Afghanistan quickly, they conquered Iraq pretty rapidly. But one thing that imperialist powers, old colonial powers, have always underestimated is the strength of resistance of people. People don't like to be invaded, conquered, colonized, dominated, controlled across the world. Take Britain. Once it was subjected to a threat by the Nazis, overwhelmingly the British people rose against any possibility of allowing the Nazis to come and control Britain. It's a human instinct to be free, to have a measure of dignity, to dictate their future the way they see fit, rather than being dominated, controlled, and so forth. And this is always the missing angle. It is missing from their strategy because it cannot but be missing. I started my talk about the greed of capitalism, of these massive transnational companies, the arms traders, the controllers of oil and so on. These are interests that cannot be measured in terms of taking on board human resistance to being dominated, to being invaded and occupied. And if you want to call it a mistake, then this is the strategic mistake that I could never overcome. Not yesterday, not today, not tomorrow. If you conquer and occupy and be aggressive against other people, you'll meet resistance. And the Iraqi people resisted, and so did the Afghan people. The United States, this great power and shock and awe, has proven to be incapable of going and occupying other countries and getting away with it. Would they give up? They would not give up. So a new approach started evolving. And this I will call the proxy wars. It's a phrase that I didn't invent. Proxy wars have been around for many decades. This limit to the ability of the United States to go directly and control and invade was shown to the world to be a reality, that there is a limit to their power. So they started relying much more on their regional allies, client states, and very significantly to our talk this evening, the reliance on terrorist organizations. Terrorist organizations did not appear as an accident. And I also challenge the notion that terrorism is a blowback to US policy. I don't think it's a blowback, and I don't think it was accidental. There might have been certain terrorist, what I mean by terrorist here is the deliberate targeting of civilians, of innocent people. But this organized type terrorism with an ideology, clearly defined ideology, and approach to minorities, to sects, to other religions. This type of terrorism is completely new to the region. And it grew originally through US support for armed groups in Afghanistan against Soviet presence in Afghanistan. Once the Soviet Union was defeated and left Afghanistan, some of these groups grew stronger domestically. The Taliban itself was the product of CIA support. They established these schools along the Pakistan-Afghan borders, and this is where the Taliban grew with CIA support. Later on, many volunteers went from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia financing various groups and organizations to go and volunteer and fight in Afghanistan. And so-called Al-Qaeda grew there, Bin Laden, who later on turned against the United States. But this is, if you like, within a Middle Eastern context, this is where it started. But the way it evolved and the way we see it today started with the Iraq War, 2003 onwards. As the resistance in Iraq grew to the presence of US forces in the country, the United States saw that it's impossible for it to dominate Iraq, to control its people. So like any power in the past, from colonial times till today, divide and rule became a very important part of their presence in Iraq. So they look at Iraqi society. There are different religions, different sects, different ethnicities. And they started very actively working on this. They started before the war, but they escalated it afterwards. And one of the trends they latched on to from 2005-06 onwards is this violent sectarian approach, which can be linked very directly to so-called Wahhabism. Wahhabism is a, if you like, religious cult and a world outlook which is at the heart of the Saudi royal family. Historically, it started in the mid-18th century, and later on, the Saudi clan, because that area was called the Arabian Peninsula. This word Saudi refers to a family, to a clan, which became a state from 1901 onwards. The Saudi clan adopted Wahhabism because Wahhabism a reference to somebody called Muhammad Abdul Wahab, mid-18th century interpreter of Islam, who adopted the most violent, the most extreme, the most reactionary type approach to society and the social world. And the Saud clan, in the town they were in, they used to invade and pillage surrounding villages and towns. They used to adopt these terror tactics. And they adopted Wahhabism as their approach and understanding of Islam. And eventually they conquered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula and established the so-called Saudi state. This ideology, this approach, and you can see it in the nature of this regime in Saudi Arabia, one of the most ruthless on planet Earth. And if you want to understand why ISIS does certain things, chopping people's heads, the way they sell women, chop people's arms, legs, then you don't need to go further than looking at the way the Saudi regime has been ruling. Every single aspect of ISIS type brutality has originated from the Saudi state and the way it treats its own people. And they spread this type of sectarianism very actively in Iraq, blowing up Shia mosques, Sunni mosques, funerals, weddings, markets. No market in Baghdad was not bombed. All the popular markets, bakeries, you name it. And the so-called leader of ISIS today was a prisoner in one of the US camps, Camp Bukka. Nowadays they say no, he wasn't in Camp Bukka, he was in Abu Ghraib and so on. There is a bit of a dispute as to where he was exactly detained. Significantly, when the United States officially left Iraq to withdraw, before that they handed their prisoners to the Iraqi government. Some of these prisoners were never handed over, including the leader of ISIS, so-called Baghdadi. These terrorist organizations were also linked to the rise of sabotaging Syrian society. It is not true to say that US intervention in Syria or Saudi intervention in Syria started in 2011 with the so-called Arab Spring. Intervention in Syria almost immediately started after the occupation of Iraq in 2003. There were actually clashes between US forces and Syrian forces along Iraqi-Syrian borders. US forces killed 6 Syrian soldiers in 2003. They started sending saboteurs, special forces, linking up with the sectarian groups, financing them inside Syria. And this type of policy had to come to some sort of a head, a clash. And from 2011 onwards, the way they had already prepared the scene, they capitalized on popular protests, on popular demands, and they infiltrated popular movements inside Syria, just like they did later on, earlier on in Libya. Obviously, whether you're talking about Libya or Syria, people have legitimate demands for democratic freedoms, for democratic rights. But these people who have been struggling, not from 2011, for many decades for democratic rights, for freedom not only from imperialist control, but also freedom within their own societal context, whether in Syria, Libya, Iraq, or elsewhere. But these sectarian organizations capitalized on these earlier interventions and influenced the scene in Syria as it evolved, as we see it today, into these completely tragic situation of destroying the great state of Syria, Syrian society, which has, in many ways, like Iraq, had many religions and ethnicities, more or less coexisting in peace for millennia, thousands of years, really. And if you look at the history of the region, you will see that, especially in Iraq and Syria, that there is no history of communal fight amongst the people. There is a history of repressive regimes using sectarian politics and so on, divide and rule politics, but amongst the people themselves, amongst these communities, there is no history of violent conflict. There are sects, there is even sectarian thought in society, but that sectarian thought and approach never got elevated to communal fight. So this is why I'm saying that the rise of these terrorist organizations is a new phenomena in the Middle East. The way they would target the Shia or Christians or Kurds or Yazidis and so on and so forth is new to the region. The way they have interpreted and distorted the Islam that is practiced by the overwhelming majority of the peoples of the area can be seen to be totally alien to the traditions of these societies. Now, the growth of these organizations is often also, as I said earlier, is described as a blowback. I think that is not right. I think there is much more to it than, and I will refer back again to Wesley Clark, and I'll show you a bit about Vice President Joe Biden and so on.
So you're in a little bit of a dilemma on that. We need to leave that kind of fuzzy on this, but we need the authorization to follow the leads, put the troops in, and play this. Look, ISIS got started through funding from our friends and allies, because as people will tell you in the region, if you want somebody who will fight to the death against Hezbollah, you don't put out a recruiting poster and say, you know, sign up for us, we're going to make a better world. You go after zealots, and you go after these religious fundamentalists who fight Hezbollah.
But General, I'm hearing you on...
It's like a Frankenstein.
I'm hearing you on keeping Syria fuzzy, but I mean, they've been very clear in wanting to destroy and dismantle ISIS, so that's not fuzzy to me at all. That the question would be, if they wipe out ISIS in Syria, which is the goal, then what with Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah.
There has to be a plan for that phase.
Well, some things you can't exactly plan that clearly because you're dealing in the realm of politics. So part of it is,
I'll stop it here. But that was a clear reference to the funding. And if we listen to Vice President Joe Biden, putting it in even starker terms about the funding and backing of ISIS and Al-Qaeda by US allies.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, And we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So what happened? Now all of a sudden, I don't want to be too facetious, but they have seen the Lord. Now we have, the president's been able to put together a coalition of our Sunni neighbors, because America can't once again go in to a Muslim nation and be the aggressor. It has to be led by Sunnis to go and attack a Sunni organization. And so what do we have for the first time? Now Saudi Arabia has stopped the funding going in. Saudi Arabia is allowing training on its soil of American forces under Title X open training. The Qataris have cut off their support for the most extreme elements of the terrorist organizations. And the Turks, President Erdogan told me, he's an old friend, said, you were right, we let too many people through. Now they're trying to seal their border. What my
Okay, there are two points here you probably noticed. He's trying to make as though the United States had nothing to do with it. It's all the Saudis and the Qataris and my friend Erdogan, he says, and so on. Well, come on, we're not babies here. We know how politics works, and we know how the United States is such an influence on these states. There is no way a NATO member like Turkey would engage in such a massive operation of sending thousands of, about 30,000 fighters from across the world came through Turkey into Syria. There is a command center in a city called, not sure if it is in Adana or another town, but the headquarters of coordinating with the armed groups in Syria is based in Turkey. And that headquarters is populated by Turkish generals, American generals and CIA, by Britain, by other countries, and they coordinate activity with some of the armed groups inside Syria. So to stand there and just pretend that it's all to do with their allies is not, but at least he has exposed on the record officially how ISIS was started and backed by US allies, and he says they were called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is also true. They split with Al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. But this is not the only player in the region. There's an elephant in the room which nobody wants to talk about in our media, which is Israel. Israel has an enormous interest in seeing Syria destroyed, because Syria is the only Arab state in the Middle East which has refused to deal with Israel. And they put a condition, all Syrian regimes put the condition that unless, because Syria is occupied territory, and this is often forgotten, the Golan Heights is occupied by Israel since 1967. No Syrian government would dare establish normal links or relations with Israel without getting the Golan Heights back. Huge chunk of Syria occupied by Israel. At some stage, the Syrian government dealt with the Saudis. The Saudis promised the Syrian government, Hafez Assad, at the time, the father of Bashar al-Assad, that through their influence with the United States, they could get Israel to withdraw from Golan Heights. Well, there is no such thing, because that strategy completely failed. That's why Syria gradually moved to an alliance after 1979, the Iranian Revolution, into alliance with Iran, because they realized there is no way they can get the Golan Heights. So they started supporting later on by the 1990s, supporting Hamas in Syria, in Palestine, supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. They started fighting Israel without having a direct war because of the imbalance of forces between Syria and Israel. Israeli tanks are an hour's drive from Damascus, by the way, on the Golan Heights border with the rest of Syria, from occupied Golan into the rest of Syria. And Israel is very conscious of this. So when the armed groups started in Syria, people thought that no, Israel is not in it, Israel is not interested, and so on. Well, this is Netanyahu visiting Syrian fighters who come into the Golan. They get treated in Israeli hospitals, armed again and sent back into Syria. Unfortunately, the translation is in Hebrew, so
ما كان في معاملة يعني معاملتهم سيئة كانت معنا. سلامتك. الله يعطيكم العافية. الله يعطيكم العافية.
واليوم.
Now, the Syrian fighter is thanking Israel and saying, speaking in Arabic, that Israel is much more generous than Jordan and the other states who receive them occasionally, and Netanyahu was very pleased with that. Now, in terms of strategy for Israel, let's listen to the ex-Mossad chief.
Ephraim Halevi, what outcome do you think the Israeli government wants to see in Syria? A victory for Assad or a victory for the rebels? Or is this Syrian civil war dragging on actually the best of both worlds for Israel because it neutralizes a threat on the country's border, as some would say it's useful, and it distracts attention from the Palestinian problem?
First of all, 6 successive Israeli prime ministers tried to get peace with Syria. 6 of them. And none of them was able to do this. Syria is the key to peace in the Middle East. It has always been Syria and not any other country. Secondly, I want to say very clearly that the problem in Syria today is not the Syrians. It's the external involvement in Syria. The
On both sides or one side?
The Syrians entered a civil war. And within the last few years, at least 3 foreign elements have entered Syria. One was the Hezbollah, and Assad tried, with the help of the Hezbollah, to overcome the opposition, and the Hezbollah failed. Secondly, the Iranians came in, and they failed dismally. And then the Russians had to come in because the Iranians had failed, and the Russians came in, and they
would all say foreign fighters came in on the other side.
Foreign fighters are foreign fighters, but the Hezbollah had nothing to do there, the Iranians had nothing to do there, and I think the Russian presence is not contributing even to Russian.
So to deal with my question, what does Israel, in your view, want to see as the outcome in Syria? Assad staying or Assad going? A victory for the rebels or the victory for the government?
I think,
or neither?
I think what Israel would like to see would be an outcome where an independent Syria, independent from foreign intervention, was left to its own and was able to chart its course.
So an independent Syria with Assad in control would be fine, as long as it was.
I didn't say in control. I say an independent Syria in the confines of the Syrian borders would be able to chart a policy of, shall we say, of peace and of acceptance with its neighbors.
It's a wonderful description. I'm sure many people would support it. You're not actually answering the question. With Assad in charge or the rebels in charge?
Whoever is in charge.
So Israel doesn't have a view, as your answer?
Whoever is in charge and is willing to follow such a policy.
So to be clear, Israel does not have a preference between the rebels and Assad. It's whoever sticks to this description.
I think we have no preference.
Okay, you say no preference. There have been reports that Israel has been treating wounded Syrian rebel fighters in its hospitals on the border, including fighters from Nusra Front, which is of course the Al-Qaeda proxy in Syria. Do those reports worry you that Israel's helping wounded Al-Qaeda aligned fighters?
As I said before, in a different context, it's always useful also to deal with your enemies in a humane way. And I think that when you have people who are wounded and you can deal with them in a humane way, the considerations as to whether to take them in are not simply whether it's politically useful or whether it's politically...
So it's purely humanitarian, you say? There's no tactical or political strategic...
I didn't say there's no tactical. I said the main consideration, the immediate consideration is humane.
But the tactical issues involved, I mean, you know better than me the phrase blowback. You don't think there's going to be blowback against Israel if you get into bed with a group like Nusra?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be blowback.
Why?
Because I think that unfortunately the rules of the game in Syria are such that you can do anything that is not possible to be done anywhere else.
Yeah, I think
that is an amazing statement. You can do in Syria what you cannot do anywhere else, and there will not be blowback. So they are certain who these elements are and of their loyalties and probable links to Israel itself. It's quite a substantial admission by the former head of Israeli intelligence.
people said that in Afghanistan too. Would you also treat Hezbollah?
He said no to that, of course. He wanted to. Okay, and in case we think this is just Israeli thinking, Henry Kissinger, the godfather of US strategy and foreign policy, also is on the record in this radio interview. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the sound, but I could read out what he says. There has come into being a kind of Shia belt from Tehran through Baghdad to Beirut. And this gives Iran the opportunity to reconstruct the ancient Persian Empire, this time under the Shia label. From a geostrategic point of view, I consider Iran a bigger problem than ISIS. ISIS is a group of adventurers with very aggressive ideology, but they have to conquer more and more territory before they can become a geostrategic permanent reality. I think a conflict with ISIS, important as it is more manageable than a confrontation with Iran. This is Henry Kissinger talking. And this is echoed by Israeli politicians, by all manner of US politicians. And you can see US policy sometimes swinging, saying, oh, ISIS could become a threat, so they limit their presence and power. But what is important to really understand, in my opinion, is that the United States has been using, forget who started it, has been using the presence of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, to strengthen its presence in the region. So they go to Iraq, Baghdad government, they say, look, ISIS has taken over Mosul. You tried to go to Russia, we overthrew Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki went to Russia to get some planes and armaments and so on. They stopped him. In fact, he was overthrown after ISIS entered Mosul. So the United States told Baghdad, literally, that Baghdad will fall if we don't come and help you and support you. And sure enough, this is the scenario that has unfolded. And there are now reports, yesterday it was even mentioned by Nasrallah in Lebanon, Iraqis know about it for a while now, that the United States, because they are so dominant in the fight against ISIS in Iraq, they are letting now ISIS fighters go back to Syria. They are giving them a corridor. Once they were driven out of Fallujah, of Ramadi, the Anbar province, and now the pushes towards Mosul, they are actually allowing them to go back to Syria because they think that the armed groups in Syria are losing the battle against the Syrian forces, government forces. This I think is quite significant, and you can also see it in terms of the agreement that United States reached with Russia regarding the presence of Al-Qaeda fighters in eastern Aleppo, Al-Nusra front, that Israel is treating their fighters. The Al-Nusra is the most dominant armed group in eastern Aleppo. They are the people who are shelling western Aleppo Western Aleppo, by the way, has 1.25 million people in government-controlled areas. Eastern Aleppo has about 250,000 people. Some say they are down to about 100,000. And the Al-Qaeda and their allies in Eastern Aleppo shell and hit Western Aleppo. This we don't see in our news. We only see what reports come out of Eastern Aleppo. The United States reached agreement with Russia that they will try to separate al-Nusra from the other armed groups in Eastern Aleppo, so that they and Russia start hitting both ISIS and al-Nusra. And once they reached that agreement between Kerry and Lavrov, there was an almighty opposition to the agreement, both within the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia. They all objected, including obviously the fighters on the ground in Syria itself. And the fighters inside Eastern Aleppo started demonstrating that they don't want any food aid from the United Nations. It's all over the YouTube if you wanna see it. I don't have a clip here, unfortunately. But the 2 days before that aid convoy was bombed, Al-Qaeda were demonstrating inside Eastern Aleppo, calling the convoy of shame. That we don't want it. We will object to its entry into Aleppo. And the United States today has become quite open in declaring that they cannot really separate al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda, from the other armed groups, so-called moderate armed groups. How can you have moderate terrorists, for goodness sake? It's a fallacy that the United States today is exposed to being behind all these armed groups in Syria, including Al-Qaeda. And now they have retreated from even attacking Raqqa, which is the capital of ISIS inside Syria. And I do believe my Iraqi friends will tell me that ISIS fighters are being allowed to go back to Syria, and there will be more of them inside Syria once they take Mosul back from ISIS. In terms of alliances, this is Yalon, who's the Israel's defense minister, went on the record a few weeks ago declaring, "I would prefer Islamic State to Iran and Syria." This is an Israeli newspaper, Israeli Times, is it? Yeah, the Times of Israel. And he says, "I prefer ISIS any day to the presence of a pro-Iranian government in Syria." And you can see how these alliances and strategic interests work on the ground. And this is the background and context that our media does not give us. We are always treated to shock, to sound bites that divorce the events that we are watching on the screen from their broader context, from the reality of the political conflicts within the Middle East. And what they don't tell us is that strategic interests do dictate alliances in the region. And if Israel decides strategic interests lie with backing ISIS, they will back ISIS. If tomorrow they change their mind, they will hit ISIS. It's a question of looking at the reality of politics on the ground and seeing how these conflicts transpire. The ultimate thing that we should not lose sight of is that the United States has certain permanent strategic interests in the region, and they will try to defend them using various forces. These forces are dynamic and they can change, and there is no fixed thing. And also one has to emphasize that not everything can be or is planned in Washington. The situation is extremely fluid, very complex. No one state can shape the region to its liking. But you can see that in terms of the major players, how these strategic interests play. Now, in terms of establishing ISIS itself, This guy, Michael Flynn, was head of the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States, the most important military intelligence agency which advises the National Security Council, US presidents, the Pentagon. They produced a document which anticipates the establishment of the Islamic State. And it says clearly that this is exactly what the West wants. That these are the forces we are backing, and they list them in the document. The document came to light after a court case in the United States. Some right-wing think tank wanted that document because they thought they could find stuff in it against Hillary Clinton. You know how politics work in the United States. But the document, although heavily redacted and still largely confidential, you can't read everything on it, there is enough in the public domain now in that document to show how the United States actually wanted to set up a so-called Islamic State.
In 2012, your agency was saying, quote, "The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria." In 2012, the US was helping coordinate arms transfers to those same groups. Why did you not stop that if you're worried about the rise of quote-unquote Islamic?
I mean, I hate to say it's not my job, but that my job was to ensure that the accuracy of our intelligence that was being presented was as good as it could be. And I will tell you, it goes before 2012. I mean, when we were in Iraq, and we still had decisions to be made before there was a decision to pull out of Iraq in 2011. I mean, it was very clear what we were going to face.
Well, I admire your frankness
Very
on the
clear what
subject.
we were going to face.
Let me just stick one before we move on, just to clarify once more. You are basically saying that even in government at the time, you knew those groups were around, you saw this analysis, and you were arguing against it. But who wasn't listening?
I think the administration.
The administration turned a blind eye to your analysis.
I don't know if they turned a blind eye. I think it was a decision. I think it was a willful decision.
A willful decision to go support an insurgency that had Salafists, Al-Qaeda,
Well,
and
a
Muslim
willful
Brotherhood.
decision to do what they're doing, which you have to really ask the president, what is it that he actually is doing with the policy that is in place, because it is very, very confusing. I'm sitting here today, Mehdi, and I can't tell you exactly what that is, and I've been at this for a long time.
Okay? So, in fact, the
In
document...
2012, your agent.
The document itself is very, very clear and very, very specific, even more specific than what he says in terms of the way ISIS has risen and supported. I started by talking about the human aspect. One thing that the United States in its policies in the region has done and is doing is to use humanitarian language to cover up for its crimes and support of terrorist organizations and its own wars of intervention that killed nearly 1 million Iraqis, that has led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people in Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and elsewhere. And really, it's a willful policy. And I think one of the starkest and most disturbing ways of looking at the callousness of US politicians is to listen to Madeleine Albright talking about the years of sanctions in Iraq, before they invaded Iraq. Remember 13 years of the harshest sanctions against the Iraqi people, not against Saddam, the Iraqi people, was imposed before they invaded and occupied Iraq. This is what she said about those years.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Yeah. 500,000 children, she tells her, have died. This was a United Nations figure at the time. That was 1996, I think. and she just brushes it aside. The price is worth it.
So my name is Daryl Anderson.
So what is it that would drive? She at the time was the United States, United Nations representative, permanent representative at the UN, and she later became Foreign Secretary of the United States. To not even blink and show any concern or compassion for Iraq's children. She tells her this is more than the Hiroshima and 500,000 children have died. She says the price is worth it. And this is what, again, I go back to this point, what goes missing in terms of trying to understand that the conflicts in the region is not about the United States and Britain trying to protect human rights in the region. One thing that I should probably close on is what our Foreign Secretary said, Jack Straw, for the invasion of Iraq, on the eve of the invasion, a couple of weeks before. You probably can't see it, but I will read bits of it at least. This is Jack Straw talking in Parliament before the Foreign Relations Committee. He was being questioned about the possibility of war with Iraq. And he says, on your point about the United States, one of the points I make to all our European Union colleagues is this, that you are right, it is the United States which has the military power to act as the world's policeman, and only in the United States. We live in a unipolar world. The United States has a quarter of the world's wealth, the world's GDP, and it has stronger armed forces than the next 27 countries put together. So predominance is huge. That is a fact. No one can gainsay it, no one can change it in the short or medium term. The choice we have to make in the international community is whether in a unipolar world we want the only superpower to act unilaterally and we force them to act unilaterally, or whether we work in such a way that they act within the multilateral institutions. What I say to France and Germany and all my other European Union colleagues is take care, because just as America helps to define and influence our politics, so what we do in Europe helps to define and influence American politics. And this is the punchline. We will reap a whirlwind if we push the Americans into a unilateral position in which they are at the center of this unipolar world. Now, if this is not appeasement of the most dominant power of the world, what is? And this is in the context he's talking about WMD in Iraq and the necessity of overthrowing Saddam and justifying possible war on Iraq. But really, this is the heart of the matter. This, I have not seen this said or referred to anywhere. But really, if you want to understand why Britain followed the United States and still follows it, just reread this, please. This is what governs our politicians, unfortunately, who claim to represent the British people. Most British people were opposed to the Iraq war. They showed it in their sentiments on the streets, in their political meetings, in every way possible. Even in my own little anecdotal way, I was showered with love by my neighbors, friends. Sorry. And these politicians do not represent the people of Britain. They drag Britain into these wars basically because they see also British interests, and British interests here are again the interests of these arms traders and oil companies. It's a similar scenario to the United States, except that we are a much smaller power here. And Jack Straw articulates this very well, that because of that we need to follow the United States if we don't want to be punished by them, reaping the whirlwind. And this is how Hitler was appeased, how the big powers of the various empires that came across the world were appeased by other weaker states. And really Britain can break this chain, and the British people are capable of breaking that chain if all these facts and all the political ramification, the context of what goes on in the Middle East and in the world at large is properly grasped and acted upon by the people. Thank you again. I took too much time. Thank you.